Chapter 1. The Omen. The stars wheeled silently above the College of Celestial Magic, 1,000 icy eyes indifferent to the fates of men. From the tallest spire of the Celestiarium, the dome opened wide like the maw of some ancient god, exposing the heavens to those few mortals bold, or mad, enough to read their riddles. Here, in a chamber bathed in sapphire light and the cold breath of midnight, Hieronymus Wolfguard stood, ink staining his fingertips, his robes heavy with arcane embroidery that shimmered faintly under the starlight. Before him, the great orrery spun with a metallic groan, its bronze planets ticking in slow, deliberate arcs. Candlelight danced across celestial charts pinned to the stone walls, inked with glyphs and constellations older than empire itself. The soft scratching of quills echoed from other corners of the observatory, acolytes dutifully logging star movements, utterly unaware of the dread pooling in the room's heart. Wolfguard's gaze, pale and distant, was fixed on the sky, but it was not the stars he watched tonight. It was him. A sudden flutter of wings disturbed the still air. Noctis, his raven familiar, descended silently from the rafters, his feathers ink-black and too sleek, as if carved from obsidian rather than flesh and bone. He landed on the armrest of the astrolabe throne, talons clinking against brass. The bird's eyes were wrong, too knowing, too human, and they stared into Wolfgar's soul with a hunger that made his spine tense beneath his robes. "You watched the stars again, didn't you, my master?" Noctis cooed in a sing-song rasp. "But they didn't whisper to you, did they? Not tonight." His beak clicked. "No, they're silent. But I heard something." Wolfguard didn't reply. His hand trembled as he reached for his telescope, not to observe but to delay. He was a man who had walked the line between sanity and madness for years. Every celestial wizard did, but now the line blurred with each passing night. "You're going to die, Hieronymus," Noctis whispered, tilting his head unnaturally far to the left. I saw it again. I smelled the blood. "It's in the wind. It's close now." The wizard's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the star charts. There it was again, that cursed conjunction between Morsleeb and Mansleeb, too early, too tight. The ink trembled on the parchment where he had drawn the prediction 2 nights ago, when the stars had seemed to scream without sound. "I've seen it," Wolfguard said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "In dreams. The tower crumbling, fire, my hands eaten by starlight." Noctis laughed. It was not the laugh of a bird. It was a man's laugh, high and shrill and brimming with mirthless delight. It echoed off the dome's crystalline walls like a dozen unseen voices cackling at a private joke. "I wonder what it'll feel like," the familiar said. "Will it burn? Will you scream? Will you beg me to save you?" "Enough!" Wolfguard barked, slamming his fist onto the brass railing. The metal rang like a bell, and the entire observatory seemed to shudder. "You are a familiar, not my tormentor. Bound to serve. Bound to me." Noctis fluttered up to perch on the rim of the celestial globe, feathers ruffling in mock indignation. "Oh, yes. Bound to serve. But I never promised how I'd serve, did I? Maybe I am serving. Maybe your death must come. Maybe I'm only the messenger." The room went silent but for the ticking gears of the orrery. Wolfguard sat heavily in the astrolabe throne, rubbing his temples. The visions were getting worse. Nightmares bled into his waking hours. He had seen himself engulfed in an aurora of screaming starlight, his flesh peeling away in long strips, leaving behind a glimmering, hollow silhouette. He had felt the bones of reality crack beneath his feet as he plummeted into a sky that swallowed rather than stretched. But worst of all, each vision began the same way. Noctis sitting upon his shoulder whispering into his ear. It's time. The first time it happened, Wulfgar dismissed it as dream echo. The second time, he began to worry. By the fifth, he started writing his will. Tonight was the seventh. He turned to the scrying basin beside the throne, filled with liquid silver. Chanting softly, he passed his hand over the surface. Ripples shimmered and spread, revealing a swirling vision, a tower falling, bricks torn loose as if yanked by unseen hands. At the apex, Wulfgar stood screaming, his face melting like wax under some unseen light. At the base of the crumbling tower, amidst bodies twisted by magic, stood Noctis, gargantuan now, man-sized, wings spread wide and haloed by broken constellations, laughing. Wulfgar recoiled. The basin cracked, not from his touch, but from within. "No," he muttered, "this cannot be. Familiars are bound by the winds. They don't grow, they don't change." "But I do," whispered Noctis. "I have. Because you did, Master. You plucked at truths not meant for mortals. You reached beyond the veil. You dared to name the stars, liars." A thunderclap cracked the night, and a gust of wind burst through the dome above. Papers flew, candles flickered out, and lightning danced across the sky like screaming veins. Down below, the streets of Altdorf shuddered as the wind moaned unnaturally. Noctis flew up into the rafters, wings trailing stardust. "Mark it, Hieronymus," he croaked, fading into shadow. "You die in 13 nights, atop your spire, screaming." The wizard sat alone in the darkened chamber, the echo of the prophecy coiled tight around his throat like a noose of words. The stars were silent, but something else was listening. Chapter 2. Portents of Doom. The sun had not yet risen over Altdorf when Hieronymus Wulfgar descended the spiral stairs of the Celestarium, his robes clinging damply to his frame with the stink of sweat and old incense. He hadn't slept, again. His fingers, ink-stained and trembling, clutched a scroll bound with silver thread, its parchment fresh, its message grim. It contained his latest observations, and if the college still had any wisdom, they would heed them. The halls of the College of Celestial Magic, for all their majesty, held a coldness not even the hearths could banish. Blue-tinted glass windows filtered the dawnlight, casting shifting star patterns on the stone floors. Paintings of great astrologers, long dead and many long mad, watched silently from gilded frames as Wulfgar passed beneath them. At the council chamber doors, 2 apprentices in dark navy robes stood guard. They recognized him immediately and moved aside, though not without furtive glances at his unkempt appearance and the restless twitch in his eyes. Inside, a half-circle of robed wizards sat before a great star-hap etched into obsidian. The Council of 6, senior masters of the Celestial Order, regarded Wulfgar as he stepped into the center of the room. Their expressions were bland, too accustomed to the rantings of dream-maddened seers to be shaken easily. He unrolled the scroll and cleared his throat. "There is a convergence forming," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the vaulted chamber. "One we have not seen in 500 years. Mhar'Zhul's trajectory is accelerating. The constellation of the bound Hydra is inverted, and—" he hesitated. "The Raven speaks." That got their attention, slight, almost imperceptible stiffenings of shoulders, a narrowing of eyes. High astromancer Volker von Reinhardt, oldest and most irritable among them, raised a bushy brow. "Wulfgar," he drawled, "is this another episode? You know familiars are not meant to speak prophecy. You must understand the winds twist perception. What you see is not always—" "I know what I see," Wulfgar snapped. "I know when a star burns wrong. I know when the sky lies, and I know Noctis has predicted 7 disasters in the last 3 months, each to the hour." He slammed a thick leather ledger onto the dais. Its pages flooded open to entries meticulously inked, dates, times, descriptions. A rock slide in the Black Mountains. Precisely on the day and hour Noctis cawed, "The stones will bleed." A fire in the Altdorf docks, when the smoke eats the moon. The death of a minor noble, torn apart by his own hounds, when the hounds remember hunger. Each event matched Noctis's grim whispers. Each prediction had come wrapped in jest, riddles, or cruel little rhymes, yet always accurate, like the bird relished watching horror unfold. "I verified them myself," Wulfgard continued, voice low, fevered. "Even the smallest details. He knew them before they happened." Master Elzara Windweaver, sharp-eyed and silver-hailed, tilted her head. "Familiars are mirrors of their masters. Could it be, Hieronymus, that you are the source of these prophecies? That your subconscious threads these fates, and the raven simply echoes you?" Wulfgard's lip curled. "Then why does he laugh before they occur? Why does he wake me screaming before the earth shakes?" A long silence followed. Volker finally leaned forward, placing his gnarled hands on the star map. "Your past service is not forgotten, Wulfgard. But you walk a dangerous edge. This obsession is consuming you. We will assign an observer to monitor your familiar for aberrations. In the meantime, continue your duties. And sleep." "Sleep?" Wulfgard hissed. "Do you know what I see when I sleep, Volker? Me, burning, my bones cracking like firewood. Noctis laughing. Not like a bird, but like a man." He turned, disgusted, and swept from the room before they could respond. He returned to his quarters in the upper celestial tower as dawn broke. The light was no comfort. He threw open the windows, letting in the cold air, and collapsed into a chair before his writing desk. The ledger sat before him, half filled with predictions and grim notations. He opened it, dipped his quill, and added a new entry. 7th night. Noctis watched the stars, then whispered, "Soon the sky will bleed silver. A blade will rise from below." Behind him, the familiar perched atop a bronze bust of Keplerian the Mad. Noctis was silent, preening a single wing. But Wulfgard could feel his gaze, sharp as a scalpel, unblinking. "Are you proud of yourself?" Wulfgard asked aloud. "Is this some game to you?" Noctis slowly turned his head. Then, in a voice filled with sickening glee, "Soon you'll see the rivers run backward, and the dead will dance." That evening, the first sign arrived. From the observatory, Wulfgard and several apprentices watched the horizon darken unnaturally. A storm brewed with unnatural speed over the Reifgwald forest. But it was not rain that came. At precisely midnight, a cascade of glowing silver rain fell from the sky, splashing against the college's wards and hissing like acid. In the streets below, people screamed as drops fell upon flesh, searing skin, peeling it in long strips, burning through clothes, melting through armor. A wagon near the gates exploded as its horses reared and shattered their yokes in panic. One poor soul, an apothecary caught without cover, was reduced to a steaming pile of bones and bubbling flesh within seconds. Wulfgard stood at the top of the spire, hair whipping in the storm wind, arms spread wide. The silver rain didn't touch him. It fell around him. Noctis perched on his shoulder, wings tucked, whispering sweetly. "See, I told you, blade from below. They never look down, do they?" From the cracked cobbles of Altdorf's eastern district, something rose. Not a creature, but a shape, made of liquid silver and screeching starlight. A dagger of pure weird energy, slowly spinning, as if choosing its next victim. Its screams echoed through the city as it lunged into the streets. And above it all, Wulfgard laughed, not in joy, but in madness. because now he understood. Noctis wasn't just predicting doom. He was guiding. Chapter 3. Echoes from Mhar'Zhul. The night Mhar'Zhul screamed, the sky ruptured like torn silk. Above Altdorf, the stars dimmed beneath the leering green face of the accursed moon. It pulsed, veined with veins of shifting corruption, its glow intensifying until the sky was drowned in a sickly emerald haze. Then, as if the heavens themselves had vomited forth blasphemy, a comet burst from the side of Mhar'Zhul, silent, jagged, and utterly wrong. It didn't fall. It raked across the sky like a claw, trailing a smear of fire and warp taint that shimmered with oily malevolence. Observers across the empire dropped to their knees or fled screaming, blinded or mad. To those attuned to the winds of magic, the impact was immediate, a spike of agony, as if the very firmament was shrieking through their skulls. Hieronymus Wulfgard, standing atop the observatory tower, bled from his nose and ears as the comet passed. The air vibrated, the brass instruments shrieked, glass cracked, and Noctis, perched upon the celestial orrery, arched his wings wide and laughed so hard it sounded like a murder of crows screaming through a hurricane. "Ah, the child of the womb returns," he crooned. "You feel it, don't you? The door is open now." By dawn, the college was in chaos, and the sky retained a bruise of green that did not fade. Wizards argued in corridors, some vomiting blood as the winds fluctuated wildly. Several lower acolytes had clawed out their own eyes during the night. 2 leapt from the spire, and in the city below, panic churned like a wounded beast. The comet had been seen all across Reckland, Talabecland, and even Nordland. Rumors ran like wildfire. Some spoke of an army of beastmen massing in the Drakkwald. Others whispered of Skaven surfacing in Talabheim. A few drunkards claimed to see something walking in the light of Mhar'Zhul, massive and misshapen, dragging chains made of screams. The Emperor ordered immediate magical reconnaissance. Wulfgard was summoned to the council chambers again. This time there was no skepticism. The 6 archmages sat pale-faced beneath a star-hap that now pulsed faintly with green rot. Volker, voice rasping like rusted hinges, handed Wulfgard a sealed scroll. "You will go to Talabheim. The comet's tail grazed the forests there, our seers believe. Something fell, or emerged." "And if it's a demon?" Wulfgard asked, voice hollow. Volker looked away. "We are sending others." By dusk, a covered carriage rattled out of Altdorf, flanked by black-cloaked outriders from the college. Inside rode Wulfgard, silent, gaunt, with his staff across his knees, and Noctis perched in a corner like a malignant gargoyle. Across from him sat 2 more mages, Lucas Tiefenwald, amber-eyed and hawk-nosed, master of astromancy, with veins like black ink crawling up his forearms from past warp exposure. Beside him, Magister Elspeth Raken, thin as wire and cold as death, hair white and stiff as parchment, her lips rarely moving except to utter words of binding. She said nothing the entire ride, but her eyes never left Noctis. Neither trusted Wulfgard. They had heard the rumors. Of his talking familiar, of his isolation, of the silver rain that had burned half a district and stopped only when he stepped out onto the street. And then there was the 4th passenger. Opposite the college mages, in a corner wrapped in shadow and disdain, sat witch-hunter Ulrich van Drag. His coat was scorched, black leather peeled like skin from old wounds. His face bore an old burn that ran from temple to jaw, an ancient brand of chaos, purged in flame. His hat was low, his eyes narrow, and across his lap rested a loaded repeater pistol. "I'm here because the Emperor commanded oversight," he said after hours of silence, "not because I believe any of you should still be breathing." Wulfgard met his gaze. Would you prefer to face what fell from Mhar'Zhul alone? I prefer to burn whatever it is, and you with it. They reached Talibeklan's border under skies thick with unnatural clouds. The trees of the Talibeklan forests had begun to wither. Leaves curled black on the boughs. Birds flew in circles before crashing to the ground in spasms. Streams frothed and hissed. The horses grew agitated, and 2 had to be put down after they began screaming in voices that did not belong to beasts. The air smelled of iron and wet fur. Wulfgarde's teeth ached with every mile. The winds here were wild, the heavens shrieked silently at him, and his every spell prickled with backlash. Time ticked wrong. The sun blinked. Then came the corpses. They found the first scouting party on the 5th day, Talibekland Rangers, torn to shreds. Not cut, not shot. Torn. Limbs separated not by blade, but brute strength. One man's rib cage had been peeled open, lungs missing. Another's face had been bitten off in one massive bite. The trees nearby were daubed with crude sigils in blood. Symbols of chaos. Beastmen, Lucas muttered, voice shaking. A war herd. A big one. Elspeth knelt beside the bodies, tracing runes of warding. They're not moving like beasts. These were ritual killings, purposeful, controlled. Vandrak said nothing. He lit the corpses afire himself. Wulfgar noted that the flames burned green. That night, as the mages made camp in a clearing surrounded by wards, Wulfgar could not sleep. He stared up at Mhar'Zhul, bloated and pulsing. Noctis fluttered onto a nearby stump and whispered, "Do you hear it, master? The forest is singing." Indeed he did. Beneath the wind, beneath the rustle of trees, something hummed. A rhythm of heavy footfalls. A war beat. Then distant howls. Then closer. Then silence. Wulfgar stood slowly. From the tree line, eyes blinked. Hundreds. The first to emerge was 10 feet tall, horned, its skin blackened and crusted with dried blood. It carried an axe bigger than a man and wore a cloak of flayed faces. Around its neck dangled charms of bone and brass, glowing faintly. Then the horde came. Not just beastmen, something else. Warped shapes, half-seen horrors. Eyes that blinked in threes, teeth that grew from knees. A howling tide of chaos. The mages scrambled to defend the camp. Lucas screamed the incantation for a falling star, a globe of searing fire erupting from the sky and smashing into the tree line, turning trees and flesh into ash. Elspeth raised walls of wind, slicing through charging mutants like glass. Their bodies howled even as they died. Vandrak fired 5 shots, each hitting a different skull with precision. His final bullet burst into holy fire and tore through the chest of a charging brute that bled worms. Wulfgar stood at the center, arms raised, his staff glowing blue. He called down a bolt of pure starlight. It did not explode, it pierced, a needle of searing force that reduced 3 creatures to smoking skeletons before fusing the earth to glass. Noctis circled above, cackling, singing in some ancient tongue. Luthar circled over. The battle raged till dawn. Blood soaked the grass, the stench of magic and meat hung heavy. The survivors, what few remained, gathered in silence. Wulfgar's hands trembled. His heart beat a rhythm he no longer recognized. Vandrak spat blood onto the ground and growled, "This wasn't a raiding party. It was a scouting vanguard. They're testing us." Wulfgar nodded. But inside, something deeper stirred. Because when he cast his final spell, he hadn't called on the winds. He had called on something beneath them, and it had answered. Chapter 4. A Familiar Stranger. The road east to Telebheim was a wound stitched with dying trees. Bare trunks rose like blackened ribs against a gray sky, stripped of bark by something more sinister than wind or flame. The earth was soft beneath the horses' hooves, too soft like wet flesh. And always, always, the sound, not of birds, not of beasts, but of whispers. They slithered through the wind, brushing against the ears of the living like fingertips slick with rot. Hieronymus Wulfgar rode in silence, his hood drawn low, his hands wrapped in prayer-stained cloth to stop the trembling. His staff lay across his lap, runes still faintly glowing from the night's battle. Behind him, Elspeth Browden followed, her eyes sharp, her lips bloodless. Lucas kept muttering hexes under his breath, staring at the woods like they might peel open and swallow him whole. Van Drack led the group now, his coat torn, his repeater holstered. He never looked back. But every so often, Wulfgar saw the witch-hunter's right hand twitch, an unconscious reach toward the twin stakes at his belt. But it was not the trees or the stillness that gnawed at Wulfgar's spine. It was Noctis. The raven was no longer flying. At first Wulfgar had thought it a trick of the light, but no, Noctis had hopped down from his saddle at dawn and simply started striding beside the group, his wings folded, talons clicking like the feet of a man in boots. He did not flap, he did not flutter. He paced, as if mimicking the march of soldiers long dead. None of the others seemed to notice. Only Wulfgar. Then the raven began to sing, not with melody, but with syllables that bit like razors. Jache nel votma satarakith menekad. The words chilled the marrow in Wulfgar's bones. They were wrong, not in meaning, he did not understand them, but in structure, in sound. They cut the air like broken glass, leaving it vibrating with unseen screams. Wulfgar tugged at his reins, slowing his mount. "Noctis," he said, voice brittle. "What language is that?" The raven's beak opened slowly. The eyes turned toward him, too wide, no longer animal. They glistened like mirrors filled with black water. "You've heard it before," Noctis rasped, not looking up. "You knew it, once, before you wore this skin?" Wulfgar's mouth went dry. "What are you talking about?" The raven chuckled, and this time the laughter was unmistakably human, a rich, amused baritone that did not belong to any bird. It vibrated from deep within its small form, echoing off the skeletal trees. "You're asking questions you already know the answers to, Hieronymus. How long have you dreamt of towers that never existed, of faces you've never seen in mirrors, of the stars watching you, waiting for you long before you ever learned to read their names?" "I've studied the winds since I was a boy," Wulfgar said through clenched teeth. "Visions are common. Dreams of other lives." "Lives," Noctis interrupted. "Your life. Again and again and again, in every cycle, you rise, you reach, you burn, you fall." The raven paused, then grinned. "And I watch." The trees around them seemed to lean in. A wave of nausea swelled in Wulfgar's stomach. "You're mad." "Am I?" Noctis looked up at him, tilting his head unnaturally far to the side. "You think me a conjuration of Azir, a familiar, a servant, a tool. But you didn't summon me, Hieronymus." "Wow. What?" "I found you." The sky above rumbled faintly. Morislav pulsed like a lantern behind clouds. "Do you remember the name Mhar'Zhul?" Noctis whispered. The moment the name was spoken, a jolt of pure splitting pain knifed through Wulfgar's skull. He nearly fell from his horse. His eyes rolled back for a moment, and the world blurred. He saw a vision, a tower of obsidian rising from a sea of stars. A door that screamed as it opened, and a raven made of flame sitting on a throne of corpses, calling his name not as Hieronymus. Full attention to the subject. He gasped and doubled over, clutching the reins to keep himself upright. Lucas turned briefly. "You all right, Wolfguard?" The wizard waved him off. "Spell sickness." Elspeth didn't look back, but Noctis Kerzakul grinned wider. "You were something glorious once," the raven whispered, walking alongside the horse like a herald. "Not this meat-and-blood puppet. You wore a skin made of constellations. You drank from the hearts of dead gods. The stars didn't lie to you then. You were one of them." "I am a servant of Azir," Wolfguard said, more to convince himself than anyone else. "A mortal man." "Forau," Noctis cooed. "But the shell is cracking again. The stars have begun to remember you. And I've never been more excited." The wind howled through the trees, scattering ash-colored leaves across the mud. That night the group camped by a stream fouled with black algae. Von Druck sharpened his blades under the flickering torchlight, his gaze ever fixed on Wolfguard. Lucas studied a rusted star chart. Elspeth sat unmoving, surrounded by faint wards. Wolfguard kept away from them. He sat by a dying fire, fingers twitching over parchment, trying to sketch the image that haunted his memory. The tower of stars, the door, the raven thing with a man's voice. Noctis perched on a dead branch above, staring down. "You're almost there, you know," the bird said. "One more death, one more ascension. The sky will drink your soul and birth you again." Wolfguard clenched his quill hard enough to snap it. "I'm not becoming anything," he growled. "I am not yours." Noctis spread his wings slowly. The shadows behind him twisted unnaturally, writhing like serpents. His feathers shimmered with colors not found in any spectrum, anti-light, void hues that hurt the eyes. "But you always say that," Noctis whispered, "and you always come back to me." Far to the north, a second comet began to fall. This one was not seen, only felt. Heartbeat, a tremor, a whisper. Gazakur walks again, and the world shifted just a little beneath Wolfguard's feet. Chapter 5. The Tower Beneath. They found it beneath the dead roots of the forest, a forgotten wound in the earth, hidden by centuries of rot and ruin. The trees had grown crooked here, twisting in on themselves like arthritic limbs, their bark split and weeping sap black as pitch. The air was choked with spores, and a strange electric hum that set teeth on edge. Even the wind avoided this place, curling around the clearing like a predator wary of another. Van Drake's horse refused to go further. It bucked, shrieked, then collapsed in a seizure, foaming at the mouth, its eyes bursting like overripe fruit. The witch hunter shot it twice before it stopped thrashing. None of them spoke about it. The trail had led them here, beastman tracks ending in smears of flesh and bone, scorched into the earth, as if something had pulled them down, screaming. Lucas had been the first to notice the carvings on the stones, concentric circles of stars, suns with faces, glyphs of impossible angles and geometries that shifted if stared at too long. Elspeth muttered in Old Classical, tracing her fingers along a spiral that bled a faint violet light beneath the moss. "This is slan work," she said finally. "Old, before the Empire, before even the elves charted the stars." Wolfguard said nothing. His heart thudded like a drum made of molten lead. His palms were slick with sweat, though the air was freezing, because he knew what lay beneath. He had seen it. In dreams, in flashes, in fragments, and in Noctis's ever-smiling eyes. They found the entrance under a cracked altar stone, half buried in centuries of detritus. It pulsed, literally pulsed, with energy, the glyphs along its edge glowing as Wolfguard approached. His presence seemed to wake it. The main precept opened, and 20 woodmakers. With a groaning sigh, like a dying god, the altar slid aside, revealing a spiral staircase carved of obsidian and veined with silver that shimmered in rhythm with the heart. It descended into blackness so thick it swallowed torchlight. They went down, deeper than the roots of the forest, deeper than the bones of the world. The steps bore no dust, only a thin sheen of condensation that smelled of ozone and blood. Their footsteps echoed, but always returned late, slower, as if something in the dark was thinking about mimicking them first. Runes lined the walls, slant glyphs, yes, but overlaid with something else. A second script, scrawled in demonic spiral, half-carved, half-burned into the stone. They crawled over the originals like parasites. Wulfgar stared at them too long and tasted copper in the back of his throat. Noctis rode his shoulder now, heavier than a bird should be. "You know this place," the raven whispered, "even if your little friends don't. You built this with the others, when you wore a skin of starlight and flame, when you were still worthy." Lucas hissed behind him, "Speak louder. I think the walls are listening." They reached the base. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, a dome carved into the bedrock, impossibly smooth. At its center stood a tower, inverted, pointing downward into nothing. It hung suspended by light, lattices of starlight holding it in place like threads of a web. The floor beneath it, if it was floor, rippled like mercury, and stars flickered within. The tower was wrong. Its angles defied comprehension. It had no corners, yet too many. It was both near and far, small and impossibly vast. And it sang. A slow, mournful hum, harmonic and awful, vibrating in their skulls. Van Drak dropped to one knee, vomiting blood. Lucas staggered backward, eyes rolling. Elspeth collapsed entirely, a trickle of smoke rising from her ears. Only Wulfgar stood unmoved. Noctis purred. "Yes, yes, it remembers you." The humming increased, shifting in tone, forming syllables. "Kalawa Hedge." Wulfgar gasped. His knees buckled. His mind flooded with memories that weren't his. A throne built from orbiting moons. His hands stretched across the sky, pulling comets into place like marionettes. Screaming worlds, imploding in silver light. And a circle of ravens, 12 of them, whispering secrets older than chaos. He screamed, not from pain, from recognition. He dropped his staff. It shattered like porcelain. From his fingertips spilled not blood, but light, cold, shimmering, silver. Noctis flared his wings, now burning with fire that didn't cast shadows. "He's waking up," the familiar crooned. "Just a little more." Bandrek dragged himself upright, gun raised. "What is this place? What are you doing to him?" Wulfgar turned slowly. His pupils were gone. Only stars remained. "This is not your war, witch hunter," he said. "It never was." Van Drak fired. The bullet struck Wulfgar in the chest and stopped. It hovered, spinning slowly, suspended in a bubble of warped time. Then it reversed. Van Drak's head jerked back as the bullet re-entered the barrel with a metallic shriek. The gun exploded in his hand. His fingers peeled like fruit. He collapsed, howling, blood fountaining from his wrist. Elspeth crawled to her feet, whispering a word of binding. Light coalesced around her hands. "Wulfgar, you must stop. Whatever this is, it's using you." Wulfgar stared at her. "I'm not being used," he said, voice echoing in multiple tones. "I'm remembering." Behind him the tower pulsed. The hum became a chant. The walls melted into stars. And Noctis, Kerzek grew, not in size but in presence. He seemed to exist in multiple spaces at once, feathers dripping with galaxies, eyes black holes ringed with fire. "You left a key here," he whispered. "A part of you, long ago, before the world forgot, before the stars grew silent." He fluttered forward, talons touching the inverted tower. With a sound like the snapping of a soul, the tower split open. Inside floated a sphere of pure light drenched in time, memory, and raw identity. It drifted toward Wolfguard, pulses of ancient language radiating from it like heat. Elspeth screamed something arcane and loosed a bolt of light. It struck Wolfguard full in the back. He didn't even flinch. His hand reached out, trembling, drawn not by will but by fate. "Don't," Vandrak gasped. "Don't touch it." But it was too late. His fingers closed around the light. The chamber detonated in silence. Light erupted, not flame, not magic, but truth, then swallowed everything. When it cleared, Wolfguard stood alone. His companions were unconscious, alive but twitching, changed. And Noctis sat quietly, as if nothing had happened. "Well," the raven whispered, "welcome back, old friend." Chapter 6. Stars Are Liars. The sky bled green for 3 days after the tower awoke. What emerged from the ruin beneath the forest was no longer a simple expedition, no longer a band of Empire's chosen. Now they were fugitives trailing starlight and madness. The land recoiled from them. Trees twisted away from their path. Birds screamed and fell from the sky. Even the insects seemed to die mid-flight, dropping around them like cursed snow. Vandrak said nothing to Wolfguard after the tower. He didn't need to. The witch hunter's expression was forged from fire and suspicion, a mask of faith cracked by fear. His ruined hand was wrapped in consecrated cloth, the stench of charred flesh and holy oil following him like a shadow. Elspeth had grown even quieter, often staring at Wolfguard when she thought he wasn't looking. Lucas spoke in riddles now, muttering about numbers and moons that didn't exist. And Wolfguard? He walked as if the world was smaller now. His footsteps carried weight that made the ground notice. The stars no longer whispered, they listened. Noctis rode on his shoulder, silent for the first time in days. But his silence wasn't peace. It was anticipation. The ambush came as dusk drowned the world in rust and violet. They were halfway through a ravine, the walls steep and shadowed. A narrow path twisted between boulders slick with lichen and blood moss. The scent of rot had grown unbearable. Something had died recently. Many somethings. Vandrak raised a hand. They halted. "Smell that," he hissed. "Beastmen, lots of them, waiting." Wolfguard nodded. "They followed the wake of the tower. They smell the power." Vandrak spat. Then the wind changed, and all hell broke loose. The first spear came from above, whistling down like thunder. It punched clean through Lucas's thigh, pinning him to the dirt. He screamed, a wet gurgling noise as his magic backlashed and set his robe aflame. Elspeth reacted instantly, raising a ward of lunar glass. It shimmered into existence just as the second volley came. Spears, javelins, crude axes, all shattering against her shield like pebbles on a cathedral. Then the beastmen charged. Dozens, maybe more. Horned, snorting monstrosities, reeking of dung, sweat, and corrupted fur. They came on all fours and twos, gibbering in a tongue that sounded like meat tearing. The first to reach them was 7 feet tall, wielding a club made from a man's femur fused with metal spikes. It leapt toward Elspeth. Vandrak shot it mid-air. The bullet punched through its eye. The thing didn't die, it just twitched, dropped, and bit Elspeth's leg clean off before Van Drijk's sword finished it. Blood fountained. She didn't scream. She glared. Another brute swung a flail at Wulfgard, who stood motionless, the wind howling around his robes. The flail never landed. Wulfgard whispered a name, not a spell, but a memory, and the stars responded. A ring of light erupted around him. The beastman stepped into it and melted. No fire, no screaming, just dissolution. Its skin turned to steam, bones collapsing like ash. In seconds, nothing remained but a dark smear on the dirt. More came, dozens. Wulfgard raised his hands. The winds of magic weren't just obeying him now. They were fighting each other to be the first to serve. He whispered words not recorded in any grimoire, names of stars that had never risen, places that had never existed. He drew a sigil in the air, and the air tore open. From the rift came chains, glowing silver and shrieking like children. They wrapped around a pack of charging beastmen and dragged them upward, their hooves flailing, their screams turning to music. A moment later, they vanished into the sky, sucked into a place that did not forgive. Elspeth collapsed beside Van Drijk, unconscious from blood loss. He stood over her, sword in his good hand, pistol long emptied, bleeding from half a dozen wounds. A beastman tackled him, knocking him down, axe raised. Wulfgard pointed. The stars above bent into a single line and then fell, not light, but judgment. The beastman exploded, literally, its rib cage inverted, its organs hurled across the ravine like flaming jelly. Van Drijk sat up, covered in steaming gore. Noctis finally laughed. "Oh, well done," the raven purred, fluttering to Wulfgard's shoulder. "That one almost had you. That would have been death number 9, wouldn't it?" Wulfgard didn't answer. The ground around them was littered with corpses, twisted, mangled, half-erased by his magic. Some were still twitching. One poor creature had turned inside out and now sobbed quietly, its voice a garbled mockery of prayer. The ravine was silent once more. Lucas groaned behind a rock, still pinned. Elspeth bled quietly, pale and unconscious. Van Drijk stared at Wulfgard like he was staring at chaos itself. "You're not a man," the witch hunter said hoarsely. "You're wrong." Wulfgard turned slowly. His eyes shone like twin stars. His hands smoked from magic long forbidden. His voice echoed in several tones at once. "I did what was necessary." Van Drijk raised his ruined hand, as if to curse him, but the energy fizzled. He had no faith left strong enough. Noctis leaned in close to Wulfgard's ear. "Death averted," he whispered. 12 more to go." Wulfgard stared at the sky, where the stars had rearranged themselves into a spiral only he could read. And for the first time he wondered, what if they were all lying? Chapter 7. Secrets in Altdorf. Altdorf stank of ash and fear when they returned. The gates did not open easily. The guards hesitated. Wulfgard saw it in their eyes, smelt it in their sweat. They had heard rumors of what he'd become, of what walked beside him. Eventually the doors creaked apart, reluctantly, as if the city itself regretted letting him in. They returned broken. Elspeth was unconscious, her severed leg bandaged with silver thread cloth and soaked with sacred oils. Lucas, pale and shivering, no longer spoke in full sentences. He only chanted star maps that did not exist. Van Drijk refused a stretcher. He limped beside the wagon, bloody and silent, one hand permanently twisted by the explosion, the other gripping his pistol as if expecting Wulfgard to strike him down in the street. Noctis said nothing, but he watched. Oh, how he watched. The College of Celestial Magic was colder than when they'd left it. Windows were darkened with warded iron, runes crawled across stone like protective parasites. Senior wizards moved through the halls in hushed silence, glancing nervously at the sky each time thunder rolled across the heavens. Volker von Reinhardt did not meet them in the observatory this time. He met them in the catacombs. Beneath the college, below even the scrying chambers and crystal vaults, lay the Library of the Heavens, a sanctum sealed to all but the archmages, a place where time bent under the pressure of knowledge, and the air tasted like ink and lightning. Wulfgard demanded access, and this time no one denied him. The doors groaned open like the ribs of a god. Inside, the library was a spiral of impossibility, floorless, wall-less, lined with tomes suspended in orbits of light. Great stone spheres hovered like celestial bodies, etched with runes that changed when glanced at sideways. Some books floated, turning their own pages, others whispered in voices made of thunder. A few had no text at all, only light trapped in crystalline pages. Wulfgard descended into it all with a hunger. He no longer slept. He devoured lore. He fed on forgotten truths like a starving man tearing into raw meat. The scribes avoided him. Even the automaton servitors built from brass and bound spirits halted when he passed. The winds recoiled from him, not with hatred, but reverence, like dogs lowering their heads before an old master they no longer recognized. He found the first mention in a fragment of a pre-imperial scroll recovered from Lustria. The Starborn walked among the heavens, flesh forged of azure, eyes set alight with prophecy. They fell when they chose, not when struck. Death did not end them. It transformed them. He found another in a forgotten chapter of the Celestial Refractions, hidden behind an illusion spell that had not been disturbed in 200 years. 12 ascended, but only 11 were mourned. The last wandered beyond starlight, his soul not burned but buried. They called him the Hollow Star. Wulfgar felt it with each page. He was drawing closer to something. No, someone. Noctis sat upon the lectern, claws scratching runes into the wood. "You're looking for yourself again," he whispered, voice dry and cold. "But the stars have always lied. They lie because they fear, and what they fear still lingers." Wulfgar turned a page bound in serpent skin. The ink shimmered red. It was a record from the first age of the college, when celestial magic was worshipped, not studied, when the sky itself was treated as a god. There it was, Karechekul, Star Eater, the 13th. Not born of man nor daemon, bound in the flesh of prophecy, he who fell without dying. Wulfgar trembled. His name? The name from the dreams, the one that tasted like silver and blood when spoken. They tore him from the firmament, bound his mind in raven's shape, and scattered his identity across 12 mortal incarnations. Each time he returns, the cycle tightens. Each time he steps closer to the memory. Wulfgar dropped the tome. His hands were glowing again. Not from spellcasting, but from memory, from fragments of power leaking through cracks in his soul. "I was him," he whispered. Noctis flapped once, lazily. "Still are. You've just forgotten the worst of it." "Moi me? Why now?" "Because the others are waking. You're the last, the key, the seed of the Hollow Star." Then Noctis's voice changed, deeper, drenched in echo, filled with ancient thunder. "And the 11 remember you, especially the one who never fell." Wulfgar's breath caught. "There's another," he whispered. Noctis's grin widened, beak peeling back too far. "She's still out there. She never forgot, and she never forgave you." The library shuddered. All around them, books snapped shut, runes flickered. A cold wind blew from nowhere. A distant bell began to toll, not of metal, but of gravity. Then, carved in starlight across a hovering slab of obsidian, he saw a prophecy. When the hollow star awakens, the firmament will rupture. The one who remains will find him, and the heavens shall burn to forget their shame. Wulfgar turned away from the light. His reflection in the obsidian didn't move with him. It smiled. And somewhere deep beneath Altdorf, something very old and very angry whispered, "I remember you, traitor." Chapter 8. The Mirror Sky. High above the storm-choked spires of Altdorf, in a chamber older than the Empire itself, the Mirror Sky waited. It was not a mirror in the traditional sense. It was a disk of impossible depth, 30 feet across, suspended in the dome of the Celestiarian's forbidden spire, crafted from a single sheet of polished star metal, stolen in the First Age from a crater that had whispered curses in languages unknown. No mage alive had ever peered fully into it and returned unchanged. It was said to reflect not the body, but the soul. Not what you are, but what you could become. Tonight the stars had aligned, not by chance, but by invitation. Wulfgar ascended the steps alone. The city slept restlessly beneath him, thrashing in nightmares born of comet light and war rumors. But up here, everything was still. Not silent, still, like the breath before a scream. He reached the apex and stood before the device. The chamber was hollow, circular, and lined with ancient silver runes, some of them alive, pulsing slowly like embryonic hearts. The only source of light came from above, where the dome was peeled open to the heavens. Mhar'Zhul hung directly overhead, its green glare casting warped reflections across the mirror's surface. Wulfgar did not hesitate. He stepped into the circle, robes trailing stardust, his breath fogging in the air, as if the tower touched the edge of the void. Noctis landed beside the mirror. He said nothing, but his eyes were wet. Wulfgar raised his hands and began to chant. The spell was forbidden, a blend of celestial, demonic, and something older, something scraped from the edge of sanity. Runes flared beneath his feet. The mirror trembled. His reflection shattered. It did not break. It fractured, splitting into 1,000 selves, each staring back with different eyes, some filled with awe, others with hunger. Then they moved, not in unison. Its reflection acted independently, revealing possible futures not yet lived. In one shard, he saw himself robed in blue fire, floating above a burning world, his face serene, stars orbiting his brow like a crown. Armies knelt before him, men, daemons, and angels alike. With a mere word, he reversed death, pulling whole cities from ash. In another, he was vast, so large his body encircled a planet formed from constellations stitched together with cosmic flame. His voice cracked reality, his smile birthed novas. He was the sky. But then the visions turned. Another shard showed him chained, crucified between moons, bleeding light into the void. His eyes were hollow, his mouth whispered truths that made stars blink out in horror. Noctis perched atop his broken skull, pecking at memories. In the next, he was Daemon Prince, 10 stories tall, wings of obsidian flame, his laughter turning oceans to glass. Altor lay shattered beneath his feet. He wore a crown of screaming souls, and his fingers traced glyphs in orbiting planets. He flinched, but looked again. In one vision, he stood alone, mortal, aged, robes tattered, bones failing, but his eyes still burning. Around him lay the bodies of gods, all slain by his hand. He wept quietly. Noctis was gone. Then came the final shard. It did not shimmer like the others, it bled. In it he saw himself split down the middle, one half divine, the other a warped parody of himself. The two were locked in combat, their blows shaking constellations apart. A voice echoed from all directions. You will be reborn either as the sky's redemption or its execution. The shards fused suddenly, each future slamming into the others, coalescing into one overwhelming reflection. Half an hour later, this frantically flowing and flickering and complicated became sharp. He saw his face, and it was not his anymore. It was older, alien, godlike, and smiling. Wulfgar stumbled back, gasping, blood leaking from his nostrils, his pupils dilated to voids. The mirror sky darkened. Nocti stepped forward, wings trembling. And then, for the first time in 1,000 years, he wept. Not with sorrow, with joy. You've seen it, he whispered, voice breaking. You finally remember what you are, what you could be. The stars tried to hide it, but they're liars, they're cowards. And now, he pressed his beak to Wulfgar's shoulder like a lover, like a priest, like a parasite. Now you can choose. Wulfgar fell to his knees. The reflection was still burned into his mind. Divinity, yes, but also damnation. And for the first time since the prophecy began, he understood. Becoming a god does not mean becoming good. Chapter 9. The Trial of Light. The trial was held in the Sanctum of Binding, an ancient chamber carved into the foundation of the College of Celestial Magic, far below the spires and domes that reached toward the heavens. Here, light did not enter naturally. It was summoned, conjured by binding circles and sustained flame, each torch flickering, with wards woven against falsehood and possession. Each torch flickering with wards woven against falsehood and possession. The ceiling arched high above, like the inside of a cathedral's ribcage, lined with statues of magisters past, judges, seers, and martyrs, their stone eyes forever watching. The floor was made of mirror-polished obsidian, veined with silver that pulsed faintly as the winds of magic stirred. At the center, beneath the Eye of Veritas, stood Hieronymus Wulfgar. His hands were shackled with runes of nullification, etched onto the links with acids blessed by Mor himself. His robe was tattered, scorched by arcane heat, and his face bore the marks of sleeplessness and starvation. But he stood tall, proud, radiating quiet defiance, though his shadow flickered, as if cast by multiple unseen lights. Behind him, perched on the edge of the witness dais, was Noctis. Silent, his feathers unnaturally still, his eyes reflecting nothing. Across from Wulfgar, on a raised dais carved with sigils of judgment and purity, stood Inquisitor General Talia Mordain, clad in a coat of black enameled leather, adorned with chains and purity seals. Her left arm ended in a hook of sanctified steel, the result of some forgotten battle, while her right hand held the long-barreled witch pistol of her station. At her side hung the Thorn of Salvation, an iron stake infused with sunmetal, said to pierce not just flesh but soul. Wulfgar's counsel was empty. None had come to speak for him. Mordain stepped forward. Hieronymus Wulfgar, she intoned, her voice iron. You stand accused of consorting with demonic intelligences, practicing forbidden rites, destabilizing the winds of Azir, and worst of all, speaking prophecy not granted by the divine, but by shadow. How do you plead? Wulfgar raised his eyes. Words are not crimes. That depends, she hissed, on who is whispering them into your ear. She turned to the gathered witnesses, college masters, witch hunters, Sigmarite priests. All watched with clenched jaws and fearful anticipation. She pointed to Noctis. The raven has been your companion since your early years, yet It now speaks languages no familiar should know. It laughs at death. It has prophesied the future. Explain that." Wulfgard said nothing, but Noctis blinked. Mordain narrowed her eyes. "Silence will not save you. We have seen the aftermath. Districts razed by celestial fire. Beastmen drawn to your path as if following a god. And now we hear rumors, a temple found in the mountains. A spiral eye in the sky." Wulfgard's mouth twitched. "They feared me before the sky changed," he murmured. "Now they just have a reason." Mordain's hand dropped to the thorn. "You are not a man anymore." "No," Noctis said suddenly, "but he's something better." The voice was not a croak. It was a man's voice, velvety, cold, unmistakably ancient. Gasps erupted. One of the priests dropped his censer, which shattered on the obsidian. Mordain froze. Noctis hopped down from the rail and grew, not in size, but in presence. The shadows around him deepened, though no torch flickered. The Eye of Veritas began to spin. "No familiar speaks under oath," Mordain hissed. "You are not called to testify." "I'm not testifying," Noctis said, wings fluttering. "I'm correcting." The chamber screamed. Every torch flared white-hot, casting flares of blinding purity across the room. Wards snapped, some shattered. Runes cracked. The air went thick, too thick to breathe. One magister clutched his chest and collapsed, foaming at the mouth. The time staggered. Wulfgar turned, wide-eyed as his shackles froze mid-mation, the links stuck in the air like flies in amber. The Eye of Veritas stopped rotating, but only halfway. Noctis lifted into the air. "Do you know what binds truth?" he asked, his voice echoing through the minds of everyone in the room. "It is not law. It is not light. It is not your gods." He turned his head 180 degrees, slowly, his beak stretching into an impossible grin. "It is memory." He spread his wings, and time broke. The chamber became a storm of visions, overlapping realities unfolding like shattered glass. The judges saw Wulfgar as a child, trembling under the stars. They saw him in the forest, surrounded by fire and prophecy. They saw him die 12 times. They saw the tower, the ritual, the astral rebirth. They saw Noctis not as a raven, but as a man with eyes like twin eclipses and a mouth whispering creation backwards. Mordain screamed. She fired. The bolt hit Noctis square in the chest and passed through. He blinked, then laughed. "Oh dear," he whispered. "Time's already decided." Then, with a crack like bone under pressure, everything stopped. When movement returned, the chamber was in ruin. 3 were dead, 7 unconscious. The Eye of Veritas had shattered, the shards hovering above the dais like lost stars. Wulfgar's shackles were gone. Noctis landed back on the railing, feathers ruffled, eyes calm. "I've said enough," he cooed. Wulfgar stepped from the circle. None stopped him, not even Mordain, who now knelt in silence, hands shaking, the thorn forgotten beside her. As he passed, Wulfgar looked down at her. "You asked for truth," he said. "You were given memory." And he walked into the lightless hall beyond, with Noctis behind him. No verdict was ever given, because no one wanted to know what he might do if it was. Chapter 10. The Astral Exile. The trial lasted less than an hour. There were no witnesses called, no questions asked, only accusations screamed from lips trembling with fear, spoken by men who had once called Hieronymus Wulfgar brother, teacher, savior. His crimes were carved into silence by starlight and spectacle, forbidden spells cast in the name of survival, wards melted by spells never taught. a scrying mirror cracked, not by touch, but by presence alone. And then there was the thing they dared not say aloud, the thing they could feel in the marrow of their bones. He had changed. He no longer walked with the wind of Azir, but beside it, as if it deferred to him. When the High Astromancer read the verdict, banishment from Altrif, the college, and the Empire on pain of death, it was spoken with such haste the final syllables blurred. Wulfgar stood silent, face impassive, as his staff was shattered, his name stricken from the archives, and the college's ancient seal burned from his palm with a brand of sanctified silver. The skin sizzled. He did not scream. Noctis watched from a perch high above, his black feathers soaking in the torchlight, a faint tremor of anticipation humming in his chest. Wulfgar rode from Altdorf through sleet and silence, cloaked in midnight and ash. No banners flew for him now, no outriders cleared the road ahead. Only the wind howled, cold and sharp, whispering the name he had buried beneath centuries of manhood and mortality, Mhar'Zhul. The middle mountains loomed ahead, jagged and uncaring, peaks capped with ancient ice, their valleys infested with beasts too warped for nature and too cruel for chaos. This was where the world forgot you. This was where the winds died. This was where he belonged. He made camp in a shattered ruin 3 nights into the pass. A forgotten watchtower long since collapsed, its stones blackened by fire older than the Empire. Snow blanketed the bones of those who had died here centuries ago, some of them human, some most definitely not. Noctis perched atop a charred support beam, his silhouette stark against the flickering fire. "You've finally done it," the raven murmured. "You've severed the last tether. No home, no name, no god but yourself." Wulfgar didn't answer. He sat in the snow, staring into the flames, watching them twist into shapes he no longer recognized as imagination. Celestial sigils, rotating runes, faces of forgotten stars. Noctis flapped down, landing beside him. The bird's eyes glowed faintly with inner fire. "It's time," he whispered. "You've earned the truth." The fire dimmed. The wind died. And as air broke, Noctis arched his wings. But they did not spread like feathers. They unfolded, layer after layer of impossible shape, fractal geometry rendered in ink and shadow. His form shimmered, growing in presence rather than size, the raven's body expanding and warping as light bent away from him. His voice echoed in multiple tongues. "My name is Mhar'Zhul." The name was felt more than heard, a chord played on the bones of creation. "I was once the 13th star, a child of the firmament, not born, but willed, a weapon, a watcher, a god not made for men." Wulfgar stared, unblinking. Mhar'Zhul stepped forward, no longer a raven, no longer a shape. He was a shadow made of galaxies, a form stitched from dusk and screaming light. Faces rippled across his wings. Each blinked and wept. They fell. Not for rebellion, not for love, but for you. Wulfgar's breath caught. The snow around him began to rise, levitating, frozen in place. "I saw your potential," Mhar'Zhul whispered. "Before this world, before the stars, lied. I saw what you could be, what you were, in that brief moment between death and return." He extended a clawed appendage that shimmered like liquid night. "I bound myself to you, not as master to servant, but as equal to equal, reborn with each of your lives, hidden in feather and beak, waiting for you to remember." Wulfgar's voice trembled. "Why me?" "Because you are the hollow star, the one who fell without fading, who fractured instead of dying. You are the death of divinity and its rebirth." He stepped closer. But the others remember now. The 11. They stir in their cages, and she still walks, your sister in flame, the one who never forgave your choice. Wulfgar stood slowly, snow falling around him in slow spirals. "What am I supposed to do?" Mhar'Zhul smiled, or at least something smiled beneath the 1,000 wings. "Become what you were always meant to be." Lightning cracked overhead. The mountain rumbled, and far above, the stars shuddered in their constellations. Chapter 11. Screams in the Crypts. The walls still stood, even as pyres ringed the cliffs, vomiting fire and smoke into the sky, even as chants from the Maw-born host rose like thunder to batter the heavens, even as the Dawnhammer trembled in its sanctum like a child sensing its parent's death. The walls of the temple held. No stone had cracked. No gate had yielded. The bastion was intact. But beneath it, something snapped. It began not with a roar or quake, but with a breath. Deep within the earth, behind vaults sealed with prayers older than empires, a sigh echoed through the black. It was not the sigh of a living thing. It was the exhalation of memory. Stone shivered. Dust that had lain undisturbed for generations danced into the air like unsettled spirits. The torches lining the narrow staircases flickered blue, then green, then died, smothered by a chill that had no temperature. Marshal Arik Thorn felt it first, as a pressure in his chest, like hands pressing against his lungs from the inside. He stood outside the final gate of the catacombs, armed and armored, his breath misting in the air, though the stone was dry and brittle. "Unlock it," he said to the 3 high acolytes beside him. One hesitated. "Marshal, the seals—" "Do it," his voice cracked like a whip. "It wakes either way. We must see it." The acolytes began the ritual, hands outstretched, chanting verses that bled from their tongues like ash. Glyphs carved into the arch of the door shimmered to life, golden and defiant. One acolyte screamed as his palms blistered and split open, the magic resisting him. He did not stop. He pressed his shredded flesh to the glyph and screamed the last line of the rite with every ounce of his soul. The door wept light. Then it opened, not with a swing, but with a shudder, as if torn open by hands on the inside. A stench rolled out, wet stone, iron rot, something older than blood. Rats scattered, tails on fire. The air groaned. They descended in silence. The lower catacombs were narrow, barely more than chiseled tunnels. The bones of ancient saints and war dead were embedded in the walls, grinning from alcoves, their sockets black and waiting. As they passed, the bones began to hum, a low, near-inaudible vibration that rattled teeth and loosened bowels. Then they reached the chamber of the wound. It had no door. It was simply there, yawning in the dark like a peeled open mouth. A circle of broken stone, obsidian tiles shattered by something that had tried to escape long ago. And in the center, it pulsed. Not a heart, not quite. It was a mass, the size of a carriage, fleshy and stone-like at once, bound in chains etched with holy writs. The chains stretched out like a spider's web, fixed into the stone floor by silver nails and iron bolts. Scripture written in blood mixed with sanctified oils covered every surface in long, looping madness. It was asleep, but no longer dreaming, and twitched. The mass rippled as if something beneath it had rolled over. Then a crack, a hairline fissure across its surface, then another. Then a scream. High, feminine, infantile, monstrous, all at once. Not heard through ears, but in the bone. The acolytes collapsed instantly, blood jetting from noses and ears. One thrashed, clawing at his eyes until he tore them from his skull. Another begged for his mother, in a voice not his own. Eric dropped to one knee, breath gone, teeth grinding. He forced himself forward. He looked upon the thing, and it saw him. No eyes, but it saw. It knew, and with that knowing, it began to change. Tendrils like calcified vines burst from the mass, writhing and shattering the floor. The chains resisted, sparked, hissed, but they strained now, creaking like the hull of a ship in a storm. The scripture began to fade. The oil bubbled. The blood dried. Above, the Dawnhammer relic shrieked, a keening metal wail that echoed through the temple. Priests dropped in the corridors, clutching their chests. Candles extinguished across the chapel halls. The bells stopped ringing. The relic was no longer just a symbol. It was screaming for help. Eric stood, hands shaking, vision swimming. The mass pulsed again, harder this time, and it spoke. Not in words, in loss. He saw every failure, every death, every scream from the bleeding wood, every child he burned. He saw the face of the beast, child he had spared, Gorthak, now grown into the prophet of flame. He saw the maw opening, and he understood. This thing, this mass, this sealed god embryo, this truth, was not just waking because the seal weakened. And it woke because the maw-born host had called it. They believed in it. And faith, real, raw, screaming faith, was power. Bomeugo turned to Paulo. Something snapped. A chain, high above, broke with a sound like a world being torn in half. The entity within the crypts pulsed again. The cracks deepened. The wound bled, and the temple above began to die, one breath at a time. Chapter 12. Horns against the sun. At dawn, the sun rose like a wound, bloated, red, and ashamed. Its light stretched across the cliffs of Dawnhammer, not in gold, but in bruised scarlet, filtered through thick columns of smoke rising from the pyres below. The air was heavy, suffocating. The clouds churned, dense and dark, trembling with anticipation. It smelled of copper and ozone, of burnt parchment and the sweat of divine fear. From the war camp below the cliffs, the maw-born host emerged in silence. No war cries, no drums. Only the sound of breath, of metal on bone, of hooves grinding into dirt, as the host assembled beneath the ashen sky. This would not be a raid. This would be a breaking. 700 strong, they formed a wedge of death. Beastmen of every breed and horror, painted in the ash of the pyres, symbols of the maw carved into their flesh. The ash prophets walked among them, naked save for brands burned into their eyes, trailing incense and flame, their silence louder than sermons. Their torches bore flames that bent against the wind. At the front of this monstrous host stood Gorthak Skullhowler. His blackened horns gleamed wet with blood. His chest was bare, thick with ritual scars that pulsed like veins. Across his back he bore 3 axes now, one of crude steel, one carved from the rib of a chaos spawn, and one gifted by the maw itself in a dream, formed of bone and grief. He raised one fist. The host paused, as if the world itself had forgotten how to move. And then he charged. The wedge slammed into the outer defenses with the force of a crashing mountain. Walls of sharpened logs exploded under the assault, shattered by the weight of minotaurs slamming into them with stone hammers. Centaurs vaulted over the rubble, trampling sentries and dragging screaming defenders down into the mud. The sky roared with the sound of holy artillery, but this time the host did not scatter. They endured. Cannon fire tore through their ranks, but beastmen flung themselves forward with suicidal devotion, dragging Templars from their battlements, goring priests with shattered horns, biting through armor with teeth slicked in acidic bile. Gorthak was a storm given flesh. He tore through the breach like a living avalanche, his twin axes cleaving limbs from torsos, snapping spears like twigs, driving forward through a sea of fire and ruin. A warhorse charged him. He took its head clean off with a single swing, the rider still clinging to the neck as it collapsed, screaming. A bolt of holy light struck his shoulder, searing the flesh down to bone. He barely flinched. Behind him, the ash prophets lit more flames. Bodies, human and beast alike, were dragged into makeshift pits and set alight. The smoke curled upward in unnatural shapes, fanged mouths, blind eyes, broken hammers. Atop the outer rampart, a voice rang out above the slaughter. "Heretic, spawn, your blasphemy ends here." A towering figure stepped forward, clad in golden armor etched with the comet of Sigmar. His face was marked by age and fury, his eyes bright with righteous wrath. High Priest Valak, the Warden of the Wall. He leapt from the battlement, landing in a quake of divine fury, brandishing a warhammer crackling with searing light. Gorthak turned to face him. The air whooped between them, their auras clashing like colliding stars. Valak struck first. His hammer descended with a thunderclap, trailing fire and holy wind. Gorthak caught the blow on his bone axe. The impact shattered the weapon into dust. Valak roared and swung again, smashing Gorthak across the ribs. Bone cracked, blood erupted. The Doombal stumbled, but he laughed. A gurgling, wet laugh that bubbled with foam and red. "You call me a spawn?" he rasped. "Let me show you the Father." He surged forward, grabbed Valak's throat with one clawed hand, and drove his crude steel axe into the priest's gut. Once, twice, again. The blade caught on ribs. He twisted. Flesh tore. Light spilled out, not blood, but light, as if Valak's faith tried to bleed itself free. Still the priest fought, bashing Gorthak's jaw, breaking teeth, smashing his knee. Gorthak spat a fang into Valak's face, then lifted the priest overhead and ripped him in half. The light died. So did the sun. The sky went black. From the heavens above, a black rain began to fall, thick, oily, acidic. It hissed where it touched steel. It steamed where it struck skin. The host roared in ecstasy. The priests of Dawnhammer screamed in horror. The ash prophets danced in the burning sludge, welcoming the omen. Gorthak dropped to one knee, blood cascading from his wounds. And she looked to the heavens and smiled, for the wall had broken. The pyres had spoken, and the seal above was beginning to crack. Chapter 13. The Dawnhammer shines. They should have known it was never just stone. The inner sanctum of the Temple of Dawnhammer cracked open with the sound of a dying world. Stone shrieking, steel groaning, sacred hinges wailing like tortured saints. The bronze gate, embossed with the comet sigil of Sigmar and layered in consecrated runes, peeled back under the weight of its own divine dread. And within the blinding vault, the Dawnhammer revealed itself. It hung not upon an altar, nor was it chained in a vault. It hovered, suspended by currents of holy wrath. The relic pulsed like a beating heart, surrounded by swirling orbs of lightning and flame, its runes glowing in tandem with the rhythm of some unknowable divine pulse. The head of the hammer gleamed not with gold, but with searing white light, so intense it cut the shadows into pieces. Its haft shimmered, as if carved from solidified storm cloud. It was alive, but not as beastmen knew life. It sang, a high-pitched frequency that drilled into the skull and carved truth into the marrow. The relic screamed. Its voice was not for ears. It reached into flesh, and then it burned. All across the breached corridors of Dawnhammer, light exploded outward in a cascade of annihilation. It did not travel, it detonated, erupting in jagged waves of pure sanctity. Where it touched beastmen, it did not merely incinerate, it unwrote them. A Bray shaman erupted into a whirlwind of ash mid-chant, his ribs spiraling into dust before the rest of his body followed. A minotaur bellowed and swung at the air, but his muscles vanished before the blow landed, and his bones clattered to the ground like discarded tools. Centaurs screamed as their hides blistered, burst, and sloughed off in steaming ribbons, their mouths boiling into black holes of silence. The light was not heat. It was judgment. It consumed not by temperature but by memory. Those who had sinned in blood and blasphemy found themselves erased by the weight of their own deeds. And yet, at the center of this unraveling chaos, stood Gorthak Skullhowler. He staggered into the sanctum, his flesh smoldering, his horns cracked and blackened by the holy resonance. His eyes bled tears of molten iron. His breath came in choking rasps, every inhale a laceration. Still, he moved. Toward the hammer, toward truth. The Dawnhammer spun in the air, glowing brighter, sensing his presence, sensing the filth of chaos etched into his soul. The runes on its surface hissed in Sigmarite tongues. It flared. Gorthak fell to one knee as the light struck him, full force. And he did not burn. He transcended. The sanctum collapsed around him. But in his mind, he was somewhere else. A world of thunder. An endless plain of broken stars, shattered anvils and floating crucibles of divine wrath. Lightning arced across the sky, striking monoliths inscribed with the names of extinct gods. Fire spiraled upward from the ground like roots, and in the center of it all stood a figure. Sigmar, or what once was Sigmar. He was not a man. He was structure, forged of iron, light, and solar wrath. His eyes blazed with fury and sorrow. His skin shimmered with galaxies. In his grasp, the Dawnhammer, not a relic now, but a celestial verdict, screamed in longing to shatter. He raised it. Gorthak looked up and smiled, for he did not see an enemy. He saw a mirror. The figure was not Sigmar. It was Mhar'Zhul, not as a beast, but as a judge. This was the Maw's true form, a god of silence so potent even the light screamed his name. The hammer would not destroy him. It would crown him. In his vision, Gorthak rose, towering even above the god, horns dripping with starlight, flanked by rivers of ash that sang in his name. He seized the Dawnhammer from the god's hand, not taken but given, and raised it high. It turned black in his grasp, its light twisted into shadow fire, its runes rewriting themselves into jagged symbols of unbeing. He brought it down onto the sky, and the universe cracked. The vision shattered. Gorthak awoke, back in the crumbling sanctum, coughing blood and black fire. The Dawnhammer hung above him, its glow dimmed, flickering, uncertain. The temple trembled. Cracks spidered across the chamber floor. The relic had not destroyed him. It had recognized him. Behind him, the Ash Prophets screamed as their eyes burst into flame, dancing into the room with limbs ablaze. One chanted with no tongue, words of unbirth. Another painted runes on the wall in molten fat. Smoke rose from every crevice. The Moo-born host had been slaughtered in the outer halls. But their faith had become flame. Gorthak stood once more, half dead, half divine. His eyes locked onto the hammer, and for the first time he reached for it. Chapter 14. The Breaking of the Cross. The Dawnhammer still pulsed in his hand. It should not have fit. It was made for gods, not monsters, for crusaders wrapped in righteousness, not horned butchers caked in sin. And yet Gorthak held it, not by will, not by theft, but by inheritance. The relic no longer shone. Its light dimmed, confused, flickering between defiance and submission. The runes along its haft spasmed like wounded animals, trying to reject the grip of a heretic, but something, some deeper force, bound them still, as though the hammer itself was unsure of what it had become. And Gorthak knew then. This was no longer a weapon. It was a womb of lies, and it would birth no more. He turned from the sanctum, its walls scorched, its priests charred into blackened effigies, its golden icons melting into puddles of weeping metal, and stepped out into the desecrated corridors of Dawnhammer Temple. The few remaining ash prophets knelt as he passed, their bodies burning with slow, ceremonial flame. None looked at him. Their eyelids had been sewn shut with strands of human hair. Their mouths were fused into grimacing smiles. They did not speak. They only burned and followed. The survivors of the Maw-born host had retreated to the outskirts of the temple, beyond the broken gates, past the shattered statues of saints, into the bone-littered gardens where pilgrims once prayed. Now it was soil soaked with blood, a place of unblessing. It would serve. "Bring the relic," Gorthak snarled. The ash prophets obeyed. They erected a new altar, not of stone or wood, but of flesh. They carved the bodies of 100 slain warriors, human and beast alike, into a spiraling pillar of sinew and bone. Rib cages opened into cradles. Vertebrae twisted into steps. Eyes were embedded along its height, still twitching, still seeing. Blood slicked its surface, a flowing baptism. At the peak, they placed the Dawnhammer. Gorthak stood before it, panting, blood dripping from his wounds in thick, dark trails. He raised both hands high. "The cross must not break," he growled. Beastmen watched, their bodies trembling from the weight of revelation. Some wept, others gnashed their teeth, many tore at their own flesh in ecstatic obedience. "It must be reversed." He turned toward the gathered host. What remained of it? No longer thousands. Perhaps only hundreds now, their fur scorched, their blades dulled, their faith sharpened by pain. The cross was forged to strike down chaos, to bleed us dry, to call light upon truth. He stepped toward the pillar, slowly, each hoofstep cracking the stones beneath him. We do not shatter it. We invert it. We turn it upon itself. We make it scream our gospel. He reached the base of the pillar. One of the ash prophets handed him a knife made from the scapula of a priest. He turned it upon himself. With a single, dragging motion, he carved the symbol of the maw into his chest, deep, from collarbone to navel. Blood spurted in rhythmic pulses, soaking the knife, dripping down the altar. The blood steamed. Then he lifted the blade again, and plunged it into the relic, not to break it, but to feed it. The runes flared red. The hammer moaned. Not a metallic ring, not a holy song. It moaned. A sound of orgasmic agony, of sanctity being unwritten. The runes twisted, curling in on themselves, transforming into jagged bestial script. The handle oozed black sludge. Its glow turned a deep, hateful crimson. The ash prophet screamed, and the ritual began, the inversion of faith. They danced around the altar, naked and wailing, setting fire to scrolls of holy writ. Psalms were read backward, in tongues not meant for air. Sacred texts were torn, their pages stitched into cloaks made of flayed skin. They gutted the corpses of the faithful, stuffing their bodies with rotting flowers and rusted chains. then lit them with stolen incense from the temple's chapel. Smoke curled into the shape of a crucified man whose head was a screaming mouth. Gorthak stepped onto the altar, bleeding from 100 wounds, the relic now fused to his back like a tumor of godhood. He raised his arms, mouth agape. "Faith is not light," he roared. "It is fuel." The host roared with him. He continued. Sigmar lit a candle against the dark. "We shall set the sky ablaze." His relic was a hammer, now it is a brand. His temple was a prison, now it is a womb. He looked to the sky. Where once stars shone, now only ash fell. The heavens wept black, thick drops of rain that tasted of iron and sorrow. The final phase of the ritual commenced. The captured priestess was dragged forward, her tongue torn out, eyes sewn open with gold thread. She was placed upon the altar beside the relic, her limbs bent into unnatural shapes. The ash prophets painted her in Gorthak's blood, then lit her from within, stuffing burning coals into her womb until her body became a pyre. She did not scream, but the relic did. A great flash burst forth, red and white and raw. The ground cracked. The temple groaned, and beneath it, in the vaults long sealed by saints and martyrs, Sing smiled in the dark. The inversion was complete. The Dawnhammer had been turned, and now it would open the final gate. Chapter 15. The Hollowing of Light. The dawn that broke over the temple of Dawnhammer was pale and bloodless, a sickly shade of gray that stained the horizon like old milk curdling in a bowl of rot. Light touched the ramparts, but did not bless them. No warmth came, no grace, only a trembling stillness, as if the world was holding its breath before a scream. Marshal Auric Thorn stood on the walls, drenched in sweat and sanctity, his armor scorched, his blade nicked and dulled by constant use. He had not slept in 3 days, not since the relic changed, not since the hammer began to speak in screams. He watched the horizon, and the host watched back. The Mawborn had grown madder and more precise. The pyres that once burned as monuments now formed geometric patterns in the land, vast sigils of inversion. Dead warriors were displayed cruciform, their entrails used to trace symbols only the insane could read. The smoke rose not as a warning, but as invitation. At their center stood Gorthak Skullhowler. The Dawnhammer, now corrupted and fused into his spine, jutted from his back like a blasphemous crown. His muscles were wreathed in black flame, his horns cracked and steaming, his hooves surrounded by a constant halo of ash. His eyes, once wild, now burned with the stillness of revelation. Auric knew him instantly. There was no doubt. The child spared so long ago. The one with the eyes of pain and the heart that had not wept. He had not died. He had become consequence. Auric turned to his dwindling forces. Only 80 remained. Templars, priests, fanatics, none untouched by loss, all without illusion. They would die, but they would die for something. He raised his sword. For Sigmar, for the Dawnhammer, for the world. And with a cry that tore his throat raw, Marshal Auric Thorn led the final sally. The gates opened, and the defenders charged. They struck like a spear of light into the side of a bloated god. The initial impact was glorious, Templars smashing through stunned beastmen, maces crunching skulls, flails painting the ground in steaming gore. Fire belchers poured blessed oil on the charging centaurs, turning them into shrieking, flaming beasts. For a heartbeat, it seemed possible. Then the tide turned. The Ash Prophets reacted first, throwing themselves into the holy ranks and exploding. Their bodies burst into shrapnel of bone and ash, cutting Templars to ribbons. Bray shamans hurled curses that turned knights' bones to worms. A beastman draped in flayed priests leapt onto a war chariot and began eating the driver alive, starting with his eyes. The battlefield became a spiral of entropy. Arik cut his way through it all. His sword sang, his shield shattered under blows, but he kept moving. Blood poured from a gash across his cheek, his lungs burned, and his knees threatened collapse, but he hunted for him. And then he saw him. Gorthak, atop a mound of burning relics, surrounded by a choir of dying priests, whose lungs had been replaced with flutes of bone. He turned, sensing the approach. Their eyes met. Father, son, victim, monster, memory, fire. Arik said nothing. Neither did Gorthak. They charged. The first clash cracked the air. Arik's sword rang off the twisted haft of the Dawnhammer, now dripping with black ichor. Sparks flew. Gorthak roared and brought the weapon down, shattering the earth. Arik rolled, slashed, scored a line across Gorthak's ribs. But Gorthak did not bleed. He glowed. Arik struck again, blow after blow, shouting prayers that fell like ashes from his lips. The blade struck flesh, broke bones, but each wound only made the beast stronger. Gorthak grabbed him by the throat, lifted him. William, face to face, now. Arik gasped. You were a child. Gorthak's voice was deep, quiet, final. You made me a wound. And he snapped Arik's spine. The Mhar'Zhul collapsed like a puppet with its strings burned, but he still breathed. He looked up through blood and dust. Gorthak stood over him, the Dawnhammer pulsing. You left me alive, Gorthak whispered. I thought. It was mercy. It was a seed. Gorthak raised the relic. Arik did not flinch. Then finish it, he said. Gorthak brought the hammer down. There was no scream. Only light. Then silence. The battlefield quieted. The sally was broken. The defenders were dead. The light, once proud, now flickered, and Gorthak turned toward the heart of the temple. The seal was breaking, and the hollow god beneath it was hungry. Chapter 16. Blood-Anointed Stone. The last bell of Dawnhammer tolled with a broken, shuddering wail, half melted in the blaze of holy fire turned back upon itself. The sound did not echo. It lingered. In the belly of the temple, where faith had once carved certainty into stone, that toll now marked the death of sanctity. The sanctum was in ruins. The walls bled oil and crushed saints, their faces eroded by the blasphemous wind that howled through the shattered arches. The once golden tapestries had blackened into draping scabs, and the stained glass windows depicting Sigmar's triumphs over chaos had been pulverized into glittering dust. The floor was a slick tapestry of gore, ash, and bone. In the center, atop the cracked pedestal of the altar of the radiant wound, lay the Dawnhammer, no longer floating. It sulked, inert and heavy, its once holy glow reduced to a quivering pulse of pale blue. The storm it once conjured had fled. Its runes were flaking, bleeding thin rivulets of amber ichor. The air around it stank of burnt blood and ozone. Gorthak stood before it. Every step he took left a crater. Every breath steamed from a chest split by divine fire and sealed with raw defiance. His muscles were latticed with glowing scars, runes carved into him during the inversion, now pulsing like embers in dying coal. The Dawnhammer, stolen and corrupted, had fused with his will, but still clung to fragments of its former self. He resisted, but Gorthak was no longer asking. He grasped the relic in both hands. It screamed. The sound wasn't a noise, it was a feeling, a jolt of utter revulsion, as if reality itself recoiled from his grip. The hammer writhed in his hands, its shape shivering, trying to slip back into the realm of purity. It flared once, blinding white, and seared a line across Gorthak's face, carving a raw, steaming X over his left eye. He didn't blink. He pulled harder, and he ripped it free of the altar. Stone cracked. The ground trembled. The pulse of light died. The altar, bereft of its charge, seemed to wail, as if mourning the loss of purpose. It crumbled around him in shards of white-hot debris, but Gorthak stood untouched, the Dawnhammer gripped like a war club of divine rebellion. Then he raised it, and he brought it down. The altar split like bone under a butcher's cleaver. Twice. The sound was not a crack, but a shriek, a sonic rupture that tore through the walls like a scream from a tortured world. Thrice. The pedestal collapsed into itself, a geyser of fire and ash vomiting skyward, tearing a hole through the temple's roof. The beam of ruin cast silhouettes of burning saints across the surviving walls. And the Dawnhammer did not break. The runes along its length spasmed, breaking into jagged, impossible lines. From its head, tongues of reversed flame licked outward, black fire that did not burn, but peeled. Everything it touched began to unravel, reality, faith, meaning. Gorthak gritted his teeth, driving the relic into the altar's core with a final, full-body strike. And that was when the crypts screamed. Beneath the temple, sealed chambers that had not seen the air in 1,000 years split open like ulcers. Chains forged from martyrbones snapped. The stone that held them trembled, then wept, then shattered. The ground convulsed, vomiting forth ancient, sealed sin. From deep beneath the foundation, a moan rose, not human, not beast, not God, but something older, something bound in truth. A voice made of hunger and memory. It pressed against the skin of the world like an unborn horror, straining against the womb of existence. The Maw had opened. The earth split down the middle of the temple floor. Fire poured out, not elemental but conceptual, a blaze of undoing. It did not burn flesh, it burned identity. Priests who still clung to life flailed as they forgot their names, their forms melting into abstract ruin. One fell to his knees weeping black milk from empty sockets and muttered prayers in reverse, begging for nothing. Gorthak stood upon the edge of the rupture, blood pouring from every orifice. He looked into the abyss and saw it, the thing buried beneath the temple. It did not have a form. It was unformed, a mass of mouths that chanted dreams, of limbs that mimicked memory, of eyes that did not see but remembered what had once been true. It was not chaos. It was pre-chaos. It was what chaos feared. The Dawnhammer vibrated in Gorthak's grip, suddenly light again, suddenly trembling, trying to return to what it once was. But it was too late. The altar was gone. The seal was shattered. And Gorthak raised the relic one last time, then cast it into the pit. The Dawnhammer screamed all the way down. When it struck the whore, there was no explosion. There was acceptance. The crypt roared, and the world shifted on its axis. Chapter 17. The Hunger Below. From the torn marrow of the temple's foundations, the thing emerged, not in a rush, not in a roar, but in a birth, slow, groaning, inevitable. The earth split wider, forming a yawning chasm where the altar had once stood, a mouth in the flesh of the world. Smoke poured out first, thick as pitch and clotted with flakes of blood that steamed in the air. Then came the stench. Old meat, wet stone, and something worse. Something that smelled of forgotten promises and long-rotted truths. And then it rose. It had no name, for names are gifts of the divine, and this thing had never asked for them. It had existed before gods were spoken, before chaos found shape, before Sigmar was a scream in the void, before faith, before madness, before memory. Its body was not a body. It was a mass, at once colossal and shifting, formed of tendrils that looked like the inside of veins, flesh that slithered between bone and shadow, and eyes, so many eyes, none of which looked outward. They looked inward, into themselves, into everything they'd seen and forgotten deliberately. Mouths gibbered across its hide, each speaking different tongues, some human, some beast, some languages no living creature could recall. One murmured a lullaby in the voice of a murdered mother. Another screamed sermons backwards in Sigmarite. A third recited the exact words of Gorthak's first breath, as heard by no one. At its center was a maw, not a mouth, but a void, shaped like a screen turned inside out. It did not devour with teeth. It emptied things. Gorthak dropped to one knee, not in reverence, not in fear, but in recognition. This was the hunger, the first Maw, the forgotten seed from which all things grew teeth. Around him, beastmen began to howl, not in triumph, but in rupture. Some tore at their own hides, clawing until their bones were visible. Others fell weeping, not knowing why, speaking the names of ancestors they'd never been told. A centaur dropped to all fours and tried to crawl back into the earth. One Ungr jammed his own hands down his throat, trying to silence the voice that had sprouted behind his eyes. Even the ash prophets fell to madness. They laughed and kept laughing, even as their jaws cracked and split and their throats filled with ash. One began to dig into his own chest, whispering that he needed to let the old sun in. And the men, those few remaining Sigmarite defenders, they broke worse. One priest began chanting furiously, louder and louder, until his voice box snapped like a taut string, and he began to bark instead, frothing like a dog. A knight dropped his blade, walked up to a beastman, and begged to be eaten. "You're cleaner than I'll ever be," he sobbed, smiling as his skull was cracked open. Marshal Arek's body, still not cold, twitched, then laughed. The hunger moved through them all, not like an army, not like a curse, but like meaning itself being dissolved. The world around the pit began to warp. Stone softened, time bent. The banners of the host curled into spirals and bled. Scripture on the walls of the temple turned to gibberish, then into one repeated word over and over again. Hungrr. The creature spoke now, and not in a voice, in absence. Every beastman heard it differently. Gorthak saw his mother, long dead, broken on a pike, rise from the pit and hold him as a newborn, whispering in his ear. Others saw the sky peel back and show the stars apologizing. A dozen warriors vomited up hands, their own, and stared into their bloodied stumps as the hunger whispered, "You are more honest when you're empty." The sky above dimmed, not into night, into nothing. Stars blinked out, the clouds recoiled, the sun, what was left of it, shivered, and the creature stepped forward, not walking, not slithering, but replacing the ground beneath it. Wherever it passed, the world forgot what it had been. Statues lost their shapes, fire froze into porcelain, water turned to dust, names vanished from memories, mothers forgot their sons. The beastmen forgot why they had ever hated men, and the men forgot why they had ever built temples. Only Gorthak remained untouched. Or rather, he remained anchored. The hunger did not devour him. It waited, like a parent watching a child's first lie. He approached the edge of the pit, looked into the eyes that had never looked outward. He raised the Dawnhammer, now black, now pulsing, now silent, and he bowed. The creature did not smile. It could not, but it unfolded, welcoming him as the first faithful. Then it spoke again, not in words, in hollow hunger, and the world took a step closer to ending. Chapter 18. Faith in the Maw. The hunger towered over what remained of Dawnhammer, its fleshless bulk a cathedral of absence, its mouths dripping with the prayers of the dying and the unborn. Where it moved, the world cracked and unspooled. Reality frayed at its edges, gravity forgot itself, time bent like softened iron, and beneath its 1,000 limbs the dead wept and the living begged for the silence to take them too. But one figure stood, Gorthak Skullhowler. Caked in blood, half his face seared to the bone, the Dawnhammer fused to his spine like a parasite made of judgment and hate. He stared up at the godling, with something neither reverence nor terror could describe. Spite, not the faith of man, not the faith of saints or fools, but the true faith of the Maw, the kind that was carved, not gifted, earned, not granted. A belief honed through flame and suffering, through the gnawing, starving ache of wanting something darker than light. The temple behind him had collapsed into a heap of weeping stone and defiled scripture. The last banners of Sigmar had caught fire and twisted into spirals mid-air. The few remaining beastmen staggered in circles, blind and babbling, licking the ash of their fallen as if it were communion. Gorthak stepped forward. He fell to his knees, not in submission, but in preparation. He raised both arms, stretched them wide, the flesh split from his shoulders to his wrists, the bones beneath glowing with sigils burnt by faith, not flame. His ribs protruded like fingers of a second mouth. Blood gushed from his wounds but did not pool. It rose, curling upward into shapes of ancient language, forming a ring of glyphs that hung like black stars above his head. Then he roared, Mhar'Zhul, Maw of all, I am yours. The sky groaned. Let me be your teeth, your tongue, your vessel. He plunged a claw into his own belly, ripping open flesh to expose the coils within. I offer my blood, my bone, my soul. He howled in agony, but it was joyful, and the hunger paused. The mouths stilled. The tendrils ceased writhing. The 1,000 eyes turned inward, then outward for the first time. And it saw him. The glyphs spun. The black flame erupted. A column of inverse light, cold, wet, alive, pierced the clouds and engulfed Gorthak. He screamed. His flesh boiled, but not away. It reformed. His horns grew, spiraled, then split into ridged branches crowned with tongues. His back split open, birthing a second spine etched with teeth. His hands became claws not made for war, but for tearing meaning. His mouth elongated into a vertical rift that split his face in half, lined with fangs that whispered constantly. His eyes, there were too many now, each blinking out of sync, each seeing a different realm. The Dawnhammer detached from his back. It hovered beside him, black, holy, horrific, and shattered. It's not broken, freed. Its shards orbited him like moons made of scripture. He rose, transformed. No longer Gorthak. Now, the Maw incarnate. The beast and the prophet and the silence had become one. He turned to the godling and spoke. Your birth is not your purpose. The hunger moaned, a sound that bent every tree for miles. You were sealed not because you were evil. He stepped forward, dripping black ichor that steamed and birthed insects as it touched the ground. You were sealed because you were honest. He raised his arms. Look at them, beast and man alike. They built temples to hide their fear. He turned, gesturing to the shattered temple behind him. Break it, all of it, not for wrath, not for chaos, but for the truth beneath the light. The godling answered. Its central maw opened, and from it came a scream, not sound but emotion, regret, hunger, faith. Then it turned toward the ruins of the temple and attacked. Tendrils slammed into sanctified walls, tearing centuries of belief into ribbons. Glyphs exploded into sparks and screams. The statue of Sigmar atop the central spire cracked in half, its head melting before it hit the ground. Light burst from every window, then inverted, becoming shadow that reached out and dragged men screaming into the earth. The temple's last defenses flared to life, wards glowing, relics shrieking, final prayers igniting. They meant nothing. The hunger devoured them, one bite at a time, and behind it walked the Maw incarnate, his claws trailing smoke, his voice a choir of blasphemies, his faith not spoken, but lived. This was not the end of the world. Not yet. This was the first sermon. And now, everything would listen. Chapter 19. Ashes of the Dawnhammer. The Temple of Dawnhammer had once stood proud, its towers cutting into the sky like righteous spears, its walls carved with verses of purity, its foundations hammered into stone with prayers and blood oaths. Now it sank. The cliffs cracked. The ground quaked with the slow inevitability of ancient revenge. From the heart of the sanctum, the hunger writhed upward, its tendrils pulling down pillars of once blessed stone like meat from broken bone. The last of the upper chapel fell in a thunderous collapse, raining shattered pews and molten stained glass into the ruin below. Fires burned green and black across every tier, devouring not just flesh and wood, but memory. One by one the shrines vanished, not by flame but by forgetting. Their presence blinked out like lies waking from a dream. The Dawnhammer itself, no longer the relic of salvation, hung in the air, now twisted and inverted. The weapon had become an icon of unmaking. Where once it pulsed with searing gold, it now throbbed with oil-slicked light, its shattered pieces orbiting Gorthak in blasphemous symmetry. Its runes had reversed, now spelling a language that unknit minds. One shard embedded in the ground pulsed with such intensity that a nearby priest trying to crawl away exploded, his bones flaring into fireflies, his skin boiling into a puddle of bubbling devotion. Gorthak stood atop what remained of the high altar, his clawed feet sinking into its rubble. The Maw incarnate, horns crowned with tongues, his mouth a vertical split of fangs and dark flame, his hands alight with scripture that burned backward. He raised one hand to the sky. There was no sky, only ash. The heavens had been blackened by the hunger's birth. Clouds of soot choked the air, eclipsing the sun. The light that did emerge was pale, hateful, wrong, like illumination dragged through a corpse's throat. The cliffs groaned beneath the weight of the truth. The river Ajen, far below, raged, its waters rising not with flood, but with command. The godling's voice had reached even the stones beneath, and the land obeyed. Cracks spidered through the mountain's spine. Entire ridges fell, shearing down in waterfalls of shattered earth, burying dozens of screaming survivors, beast and man alike, beneath grinding avalanches of sanctified rock. And then, with a single thunderclap like the snapping of a divine neck, the cliffs collapsed. The Temple of Dawnhammer, Sigmar's beacon, bastion, and myth, was torn from the world. It fell into the river Ashen in a cataclysm of ruin, its towers tumbling like broken limbs, its banners disintegrating mid-fall, its sacred halls silenced beneath the roiling, blood-black waves. Water surged outward in a ring of devastation, drowning forests, swallowing stone. The air screamed. The world shuddered. and in the silence that followed, only one voice remained. Gorthak. He stood upon the highest piece of ruin, still above the flood, wreathed in the flame of unfaith, his arms spread wide. The remnants of his warband, those not lost to madness, crushed by stone or consumed by the hunger, gathered in reverent silence below. They bore the marks now. Eyes burned out and replaced with candles. Runes carved into bellies. Skin tattooed with scripture written in their own blood. They were not survivors. They were disciples. Gorthak's voice, when it came, was not a sound. It was a presence that entered the skull, rattled behind the eyes, and forced the tongue to bite itself to keep from screaming. The cross has fallen. He raised what remained of the Dawnhammer, its haft fused to a jawbone, its head a pulsing sphere of anti-light. The hammer has inverted. The sky has lied its last. The seals are broken. He opened his arms, and now begins the age of ash. The hunger howled from the pit. The world listened, and the wind carried his words like disease. Chapter 20. The silence that follows. The river Ashen no longer roared. Its current had slowed into a thick, tar-colored creep that moved sluggishly through the shattered gorge where the cliffs of Dawnhammer had once stood proud. Soot clung to its surface like a second skin. Bones bobbed in its eddies. The waters were quiet now, not with peace, but with absence. The world breathed in and forgot how to exhale. The temple was gone. So was the cliff. So was the Dawnhammer. Only the ruin remained. The withered marches stretched around it like a corpse wound around its own spine. Trees leafless and petrified, ground cracked and smoking, the sky a bruised dome without moon or sun, lightless but never dark. Through this cursed womb the survivors walked. They did not walk together. They wandered. Beast and man alike, war-torn and hollow, dragging their broken bodies through the soot, breathing the air of unbirth. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The Maw-born host no longer existed as an army. Its structure had collapsed like its doctrine. Faith had been fulfilled, then emptied. Its priests were ash, its banners were pulp, and its prophet Gorthak had not died. But something had. He sat in the crook of a dead tree, his body more scar than skin, his horns snapped at the ends, his jaws slack and crusted with old ichor. One eye wept constantly, not tears but embers, tiny motes of red that curled upward and vanished into the choking sky. The Dawnhammer was no longer fused to him. It had dissolved into black dust the moment the cliffs had collapsed, singing a hymn only he could hear. Now there was only silence. He had felt Mhar'Zhul abandon him. Not in betrayal, not in anger, but like a parent leaving a child to walk on its own, if the parent had birthed the child from its own rotting mouth, fed it fire, and whispered madness into its bones. The maw had gone quiet, and the silence was worse than any scream. All around him, beastmen wandered like ghosts. Some danced in endless circles, spinning with their entrails clutched like garlands. Others knelt before rocks, whispering to them as though they might answer. A few stared into puddles of blood for hours, smiling, waiting for their reflections to move. But others, a few, still carried torches. Not metaphorical ones. Real, burning brands, made from the femurs of dead Templars, dipped in the fat of monks and wrapped in prayer scrolls set aflame. They bore the fire not for warmth but because it mattered. Because even without the Maw's voice, even with Gorthak fallen silent and hollowed, the fire still burned. One such beastman approached Gorthak now. A young Gor, barely more than a child by the standards of the host. His chest was carved with words he could not read, his arms wrapped in cords of human hair. In his hand, a torch sputtered. Its flame danced without wind. He crouched beside Gorthak. "Father," he whispered, not to claim lineage but to invoke something older than blood. Gorthak's jaw flexed. He did not look up. The young Gor said, "But I still feel it." Gorthak's voice, when it came, was sand dragged over rusted iron. "What do you feel?" Into the sky. "The fire. It's inside me. Even if the Maw is gone, even if you're dying, it burns." Gorthak closed his eyes. A moment passed. Then another. Then he said, "Then perhaps that is all faith is." The Gor tilted his head. An echo. A wound that doesn't scab. The torch crackled. And all around them, the wandering beastmen began to drift closer, not for command, not for glory, not even for understanding. They came because there was still flame, because the world was cold now, and the Maw might be gone, and the gods might be liars, but the fire still burned. And so they sat, beast and man, around the prophet who had rewritten truth. No hymns, no gospels, only fire and silence, and the terrible, enduring possibility that faith might not require a god, only a match